is Jim Richmond, and I'm just going to briefly welcome you here tonight. And we're going to have a great program by Carol Godette. We're looking forward to that as well as an important contribution to the history of Saratoga Springs. So we are really pleased and proud to have this group of people. It is like all our programs, it's really a combination of people that I call our regular patrons and new folks. How many people are here for the first time? Yeah, so, and that's what we usually see. We see a good portion of new people. So this is how the museum thrives. Okay, it thrives by the continued membership of people that have been, know Brookside and have been involved in Brookside for sometimes decades. And also thrives by people that are just brand new, first time that they're here. So we hope your experience tonight is good and you enjoy the program. This fall we have more programs than we've ever had before. I didn't push you taking the sheet, but there's a sheet out there of just the September programs that we have. You know, and we have a like number of 3 different additional programs in October and a couple in November. One is a Zoom presentation. So we basically have like 8 programs between now and Thanksgiving, which is ambitious. But one of the things we're trying to do with those programs is to offer a variety of historical experiences. And the 3 that we've got in September is we have our last tour, which is going to be of the Corinth Rural Cemetery, okay, that Rachel Clothier is going to give. That's on September 25th. And that'll be the last of our 5 tours that we've had over the summer. And this will be the 3rd year in a row that we've done about 5 tours around the county. So we have a very special program, I think. We've got a couple of very special programs here at the museum towards the end of September. One is going to be given by Kate Fitzpatrick. And she is going to talk, I think she's going to give the first talk that we've had in the Brookside Museum about the Vietnam War. She was 8 years old when the people were evacuated, the Americans were evacuated in 1975. And she was there because her father was a CIA agent. She's going to tell that story and what it was like to be in Vietnam, called For the Love of Vietnam. So we're really looking forward to it. I've had some discussions. I've already bought her book and read most of it. So I think that's going to be a new program for us, a new departure from what we've done. And then some of you may have been aware that in the end of July, we were going to have a program by Nathan Richardson doing an interpretation of Frederick Douglass. And 2 days before that event was supposed to happen, Nathan came down with COVID. So hopefully he's recovered. Bless you.
Thank you.
Hopefully, he certainly recovered fairly easily. And the program's been rescheduled, and it's a weekend, the last weekend in September, and it's tied in with 2 events that we'll be doing the previous day on a Saturday on September 28th at the Saratoga Battlefield and at the town meeting hall in Schuylerville. He will be here talking about democracy and Frederick Douglass's view of democracy on Sunday, the 29th of September at 2 o'clock. And this is a very special event for us because Nathan is really well-renowned and well-regarded, having done over 500 presentations on behalf of interpreting Frederick Douglass. And to have him at what I say is little old Brookside, I think is really an accomplishment, and we're fortunate enough to be able to have him. Those 3 events I just talked about, they're available for registration on our website. Okay, and we hope to see you at some of them. And I'm not going to spend the rest of the night talking about our October programs. I'll do that the next program we have. So one thing I'd like to do now is invite William. Where's William? Here he is. William Allerdice, which is the 3rd generation of the Allerdice family being our board of directors, is going to talk a little bit about the membership and how important membership is for the survival and the flourishment of the museum.
I think you did a pretty good job so far.
But no, I'll shut up. You didn't tell me to shut up.
I don't think we could. You know? Welcome. This is my favorite question. How many of you are members right now? Look at that. I almost don't even have to say very much. For those of you who are not, please stop at the table up front and check it out. We have multiple different levels, you know, starting at a nice, like, easy, like, you know, $25, something like that to get you in the door, you know. And I highly recommend if you do a $100 level, it gets you a NARM membership card, which is access to I forget how many museums across, hundreds of museums across the country, you know, which is very exciting. But it helps us. Every dollar that you give helps us bring you programming, helps us pay our staff, helps us continue growing and expanding everything. So that's, we are looking at going into some corporate things coming up this fall. If any of you have any knowledge of people who might be interested in sponsoring different programs or things for us, I'd love to hear from you. Reach out to Brookside, give us a call, write us, email us, Other than that, I think we're going to introduce Charles Kensel and get the program going. Sound good?
Enough of us. It's really hard to keep secrets from Carol Godette because she knows everybody. But when Charlie Kensel walked in, she was surprised. So I'd like to introduce Charlie. Many of you know him either because your son took earth science from him, and it was earth science, right?
Earth science and then astrophysics.
Yes. In middle school, or maybe you know him because he took a tour in Saratoga Springs on the many tours that he conducted, or in his recent position as the president of the Saratoga Springs History Museum. But that's not why he's here introducing Carol tonight. He's here introducing Carol because they've been longtime friends, okay? And he's going to tell you a little bit about Carol before we actually get to the main event today. So Charlie, come on up.
Thank you, Jim. Good evening, everybody. So good to see so many faces of people that I know and work with, etc. I bring you warm greetings from the Saratoga Springs History Museum, and it's because we do so many collaborations with so many groups, including Brookside. So we're all in the same leaky boat together, right, Jim? But the bottom line is that when I received the call notification on this, I was very, very, very honored. Carol and I have been friends for a long time. We go back. We both grew up in Saratoga, and we're literally just a few blocks away from each other. Went to Saratoga High together, etc. Went to college, then we both had the same aspirations. We came back and taught in our hometown. And after many years in the classroom, we both retired. And we've had many, many conversations over the years about her thoughts, her research in terms of how best is that to be dispersed and given out to people. And I'm so happy to see everything she accomplishes. In fact, with preservation, we're kind of like the mirrors of during the house tours. If one of us gives the morning breakfast, the other gives the lunch and everything else. We've been doing that for too many years. But it's been an absolute pleasure not only to know her and her family, her kids, husband, etc., but be able to collaborate with her and see the kind of work that she's done. This book is related here on this spot, is, in my estimation, something that needed to be done for a long, long time. As a native Saratogian, and I didn't learn how to read a map, so I never left town. So I basically used to, and we were relaying these stories before, used to get this pushback from people that would say to me, literally, so what was it like to grow up when it was a dump? Exact words, yeah. And I'd say, different doesn't mean bad. And Carol has finally captured a lot of those thoughts. This is a period of history that we both lived through, and Jim lived through it and everything else, neighborhood stores and other things and other personalities that need to be told. I'm stuck in the 1800s, and I'm stuck with my undergraduate degree of geology. So You know, what the heck? If it's not spring water, I don't know anything about it. So, but she captured some real good thoughts here. And I'm so glad we have this because it's this personal accounting that I think a lot is missed. A lot of times people will tackle things and they go at it from a pure research point of view. And they'll make sure they hit every different source, etc. But to capture the stories and the things that we lived through, you did a great job, Carol. So I'm not going to babble on, as my 3 kids would say, Dad, no one needs to listen to you that long. So I'll pass it on to Carol. Carol, beautiful job.
Well, welcome. Thank you for coming. So before I start talking tonight, I'd just like to know my audience, like Charlie and I, both being teachers. How many of you grew up in Saratoga? Okay. Then how many of you grew up in Saratoga County? How many of you grew up outside of New York State? Okay. So that's going to help me as I craft this. So there are certain universal truths that I found out. So Charlie and I actually, do you remember, there were 3 of us that retired the same year from teaching in 2010. And we sat at our retirement party. The district had a little thing for us. And we kind of talked about what we were going to do. And Charlie was doing a lot of tours at the time, so he had plans, and Chuck Kish, you may have heard of him, he had some other plans with this little thing called the Hot Club, and I didn't have any plans. And we sat there together, and I said, I think I need to find something. And as I was walking home from Lake Avenue School, where I had taught, Teachers' Voices, is my mic on or not? Okay, we don't think so. As I was walking home from school, I walked by this garage. Now, to you, this garage looks like nothing. But to me, when I was 11, this was my entire life because it was our neighborhood store. So how many of you had a neighborhood store that you went to? What are some, Karen, what's something you remember from your neighborhood store?
The penny candy, of course.
Penny candy. How many people had penny candy experiences in their life?
Excellent.
Wayne, how about you?
Hughes' Market, liquor store, all on the west side.
What are some memories about those stores that are near and dear
I
to you?
remember Johnny Hughes in particular because he had a little store before he built a supermarket. And my mother used to take us there all the time. And he had one of those old-fashioned punch lottery type things, and you would punch it. And I managed to, when I was like 4 years old, I was punching all around, and you were supposed to be paying for those punches. And Johnny forgave me.
Okay, so a kind shopkeeper. Anybody else have that experience, kind shopkeepers? Susan.
By St. Peter's with Katz's, a wonderful Jewish man who moved to Saratoga because his wife Lottie suffered from shingles, and the bats were the only things that gave her any comfort. But he let the high school students run rampant. All he did when we were there was cover all the magazines with a sort of tarp, and we did the 15 people in the telephone booth and everything, and he was the most tolerant man.
But it was like a gathering spot for you.
Absolutely.
Yes.
They would let the regular families keep a tab from time to time.
I was hoping somebody would say that. Let families keep a tab, and that was really important during the 60s. So I found that there were certain universal truths that happened. So it didn't matter if you grew up in Saratoga, Ballston, New York, or another place, that there were common things. And I said, this store was really important for me because it was a bookie joint. And Mr. Rowland, and this is Mr. Rowland's son, who was one of my early interviews. He was a teacher, and after school he would come by and check in on his parents. But really how they made money. And it doesn't look like much now, but then it was my everything, my universal club. We had moved to Nelson Avenue from Mitchell Street. I didn't know people in the neighborhood. It was my entry into the neighborhood. But Mr. Rowland's real job was to go around and collect bets. So when he went out to collect bets, I was 11, and that's old enough. He let me watch the store while he went about his real business. And it meant recording down in the book that you had mentioned, you know, a tab, because most people ran tabs because credit cards were not universal. They hadn't developed the magnetic strip. So the average person didn't have a credit card. So people in the neighborhood would wander in to get their dinner or whatever because they didn't have enough money to stretch through the whole week. He never really cared if they were caught up because that's not really how he made money. So he went all over town. He went, according to oral interviews, he went to Lou's Luncheonette. He went to various spots around town. And back then we didn't have OTBs. So he could take bets, and he would take bets for like a quarter, lots of different amounts. And every night there was a little curtain, and some of his cronies would gather beyond that curtain, and they would play cards together. So it was a community gathering. But for kids like me, it was a place for penny candy. So all the kids came and had penny candy, and there were a lot of things that went in. So I started talking to people about this. And I found out from Ted Lewis. I saw him at an event. I don't know if any of you have heard of him. He used to teach at Skidmore. He said, I remember walking into the store, and there was this man that was there, and he had this counter, and on it were a couple $1,000s, and he just swept the money into a bag when he saw me because he didn't know he could trust me. And I said to myself, something's going on there. And it was. But Bill was also well-respected and connected, and so he would find out if he was going to be rated. And here's a picture. So when one of my first interviews was with his son, Dick, who confirmed, now you got to keep in mind, and when you're thinking about oral histories, we all have different perspectives. And my perspective was that of an 11-year-old. So I knew I didn't have the whole picture, but he confirmed kind of what I thought and told me more things. And then, because of him, he said, well, you know Earl Rawlings? And I said, well, yeah, I see him at the Y. He said, well, he used to be our runner. So I interviewed Earl. And Earl, as a college student, would go around and collect envelopes all over town and just bring them back to Bill. And when it came time for Earl to need a cosigner for a car, Bill signed for that car. So there was this respect and helping of the community, and it was just a wonderful story. So I wanted to share that story because, as you know, there aren't many neighborhood stores left. So my very first stop was when Charlie was talking to the History Museum and the Bolster collection. And there's 325,000 photographs in that collection. And the man who used to run it, John Connors, was there, and my dad bought all of his cars from him. So, of course, he just rolled out the red carpet. And he said, well, I've got a lot of pictures of neighborhood stores, and I'll give you copies of them. So he gave me copies of, probably about 15 different stores. And this was one that I knew. And if you grew up in Saratoga, does anybody know what it was in probably your lifetime?
Peppers?
Not Peppers. We're going to get to Peppers soon.
That's on the other corner, right?
This is on 10 Warren, the corner of Warren and Middle.
And I can't remember the name of the people that used to have it.
Rocky and Jerry's.
Jerry's.
The Verignis had
Oh, 'cause we
it.
used
That,
to-
in my lifetime, it was Rocky and Jerry's.
Yeah.
But before that, now it's a residence. And I was like, I didn't know anything about the story behind it. So I had, armed with all these photographs, again, I did not think this was going to be the route of my retirement, like Charlie had this clear path. I had these photos, and I went to the Saratoga room, and I said, I'm going to look up what I can in the files. And I had these pictures, and if you've ever been in the Saratoga room, you know Victoria, and she knows everybody and everything. And she says to me, well, look at that man over there. His name is Mr. Farrington. You have to talk to him. I had never seen Mr. Farrington in my entire life, but she said, he's not going to be around much longer. And he said, you need to capture this because he might not be in here. You never know. So I meekly went over and I said, hi, Mr. Farrington. I introduced myself. I said, I'm interested in neighborhood stores, and I understand you know a lot about Saratoga history. So I was, and always have been, big into notebooks. And I keep these notebooks like this. And my very first notebook, I think I call it Neighborhood Stores, and my very first interview was August 27th, 2010, Mr. Farrington. And he had all kinds of stories about each one of these photographs. But there was one thing he said that really captured my attention. And it was a story maybe some of you who are interested in history have heard. And it's a story about a murder. It was a man who was dumped on the steps of Saratoga Hospital. And there was a doctor who was attending, a young attendant named Doc Anderson. And before the man died, he said, Sonny did it. Now, this is involved with the whole mob. For Dr. Ferrone, allegedly, was a mobster, allegedly. And we have no proof of that exactly. And he told this fabulous story. He said, well, Doc Anderson had to go away because he was a material witness to this murder. And he was sent to Mongolia as a missionary. And he was there, and then they brought him back because he was the key witness to this trial. And while he was awaiting to go to trial, he didn't want to go back to the hospital. He didn't know what to do. So around the corner from where I grew up, he opened this store and he called it Anderson's. And there was the picture. So that really piqued my curiosity. And I said, okay, here's a different story. Because I kind of thought, okay, what can I write about if I'm just going to write about tabs and penny candy? How is that going to keep anyone's attention? But I soon found as I started investigating, so I do write about Anderson's, but I knew it as Rocky and Jerry's. I started investigating and I said, I need to expand my horizons. And I was very fortunate to know Minnie Bolster. My dad and she had lunch together every day. And going, how many of you know of Minnie Bolster? Yeah, no. Okay. So Minnie Bolster is not, a lot of people think she was married to George Bolster, but she was not. It was his sister-in-law. And Minnie's house was like going to a museum. And so if you got lucky enough to be invited to her house, going there was an experience. And she told stories of Saratoga through objects. And I had so many different times going there. I did not write everything down, and I wished I had recorded more of them. And I would get these emails. I had to just kind of, they make me chuckle as I'm looking back. One was in 2013, 2017. If you could come by, on Wednesday, and on the way, would you get me a shake from Stewart's? A black and white would be nice. Make sure it's in a plastic container, not cardboard. Anytime between 11 and 1 is fine, because that's when she needed her eye drops, and that's when her nieces were out of town. So yeah, drop by then. So I would do that, because in exchange, I would get this wonderful treasure trove of information. She knew things no one else knew, and she had things no one else knew. For example, one of her hobbies was she would go around and pick up photos off the floor of the Saratogium. And they would throw them out. And, so she would go in there every day, pick them off the floor, and then just keep them. And so I got I'll pass these around, I got a lot of photos of corner stores or neighborhood stores that I wouldn't have had from Minnie's clever scavengering. She also was a collector of all things Saratoga, and she had one thing she taunted with me for years, and I coveted it. And I did not end up getting it till after her death, and I didn't get the full collection. But going back to that story about Anderson's store, there was a newspaper that only existed for 2 years in Saratoga. And its sole purpose was to bring down Doc Ferrone. And it was called the Saratoga Star, and it was like the National Enquirer of the time. It was a weekly paper, and what it wanted to talk about was this murder that I mentioned. It wanted to talk about Doc Ferrone. So every issue had something about it and how he might be convicted. One issue had his actual, Doc Anderson's actual testimony in it. So Minnie knew she had the only bound edition, and I think she also got this off the floor of the Saratogian, I'm not sure, but that's where it came from. And so she would always say to her, because toward the end of her life, she was selling her collection, and she would be like, should I sell this to Carol or shouldn't I? And she would tease me with it, and I'd say, yeah, I think you should, but she never did. And some people got in and took kind of the key issues, but before that happened, one day she let me take some and have them photocopied. So these are some photocopies, but I did end up buying these newspapers that are really, to me, priceless because it documents this whole situation about Anderson's store that I was able to write about in my book. So by having somebody that you can go to who's an expert, so really I want to talk to you about the importance of telling a story and getting a story. So all of you probably want to gather. My goal is that when you leave here, there's going to be some story you want to document. And you probably have somebody you should talk to. So I want to encourage you, whatever that story might be, to get that story now. Susan?
Did Sonny get convicted?
Well, in the end, yeah, Doc Anderson's testimony was considered rambling and babble. It did not sound that way to me at all. And I have some of the documented. He got off the hook, and unfortunately, it kind of mentally did a number on him. I had to round out that story. Although Minnie knew a lot, Mr. Farrington knew a lot, the Saratoga Star knew a lot, I was missing a key thing. What do you think that key person would be that would round out the story? Me? Well, now he's the one I think has the copy of the newspaper that I don't have. He got into Minnie's before I did, and that's where I think it is, yeah.
That's the police that were involved?
The police that were involved would be good. But remember that guy Earl I told you? Because usually a source knows more than one thing. Earl knew more than one thing. He said, you know what? I went to high school with Doc Anderson's son, Bob. And he doesn't come to our reunions, but I heard at our last reunion that he lives in South Carolina. So, to the power of Google, I just started going through. Robert Anderson's a very common name, and there's more than one in South Carolina. But I just started calling them. I think it was only maybe the third one that I called that I actually got him. And at the time, he was 72 years old. And I explained what I was investigating, and he said, yes, I was born when my parents were in Mongolia. And he told me the story from his perspective. He said, my father was very troubled by this, and he felt that he was always being watched by the mob. And after the trial, he had a lot of problems with drinking, and he died. Again, going back to Victoria at the Saratoga room, in the Saratoga room was a file, and our city coroner had said that he had committed suicide by drinking cyanide, according to the autopsy. I didn't have the heart to tell this 72-year-old man this. I didn't know if he knew it or not. After his father died, they moved away because he said, people always thought we were associated with the mob. I didn't feel accepted in school, so we left. He didn't know the whole story. He was 10 when he left here. But he helped round out the rest of this story for me. So when you're doing a story, I think it's really important that you get as many different perspectives as you can. And sometimes it's hard filling it in. But that was a key story. So Minnie was one of those resources that I went to over and over again. But another thing is, part of this talk too, I want to talk about visuals. So my friend Tom Denny was a professor at Skidmore College, and he was learning a GPS mapping system. And he said, well, I want to map trees. But he said, I want to do something first. Let's practice in on your stores. So what we did is we took all the stores by decades, starting in 1920, all the way up to present, and we mapped them out. And you can see the vast number of stores that there were. When I was growing up, it seemed like I didn't have to walk more than 1 block to run into a store.
Were there any big grocery stores at the time?
That's a great question. So for my childhood, I remember going to the A&P on Broadway. A&P.
And Pacific people.
Yes. So why were all these stores when there was an A&P? What do you think?
No credit at the supermarket.
That's right. And so when I was talking, Susan's mother, Ann, ran the Ann's Washington Inn. But sometimes Ann had to stretch her money. And so she said, well, when I interviewed her, she said, I always would call up Rod Sutton, and he had 5 points, and he would deliver to me, and then when we got paid, I would pay Rod back. So it was mostly because of credit that people went to these. But the interesting part, and at first I was calling this corner stores, but they all weren't on corners, is that Tom and I said, okay, let's map these out by decade. And so we did. So these are neighborhood stores in 1940. And then we said, you know what? It seems they're clustered around schools. So we put in schools. And sure enough, they were. One surprising thing, here's 1960 and 1970, is that we found Catherine Street had 3 neighborhood stores in it. And that's because there was school number 3. Once school number 3 closed, so did those stores, because that was their ready source of customers. So I said, you know what, I think this is important to write about. So originally when I started writing, my only goal was to write about neighborhood stores, mom and pop grocery stores. And I thought, when I'm done with that, I'm done writing, and that will be it. Because they each had a different story. And this is Grasso's. How many of you remember Grasso's?
Who doesn't?
Yeah. Okay, what is it today, Karen?
Near my school.
Right near your school.
Pizza.
Yeah. So, you know what was a fascinating thing about Grasso's is it really started, think about what was in that neighborhood for those of you who grew up. What was
St. Peter's.
St. Peter's?
D&H.
Something else. Across the street, Stonequist Apartments were built right the same year that Grasso's was. And they had ready-made customers, all the construction workers. And then Saratoga High, for those of you who remember moving out there, moved out to West Avenue, all those buses went by it every day. So they had built-in customers. So Grasso's was just, it didn't have one of those stories that was like a murder, like the Andersons, or a bookie joint, but it was just a basic serviceable place that was a gathering place, a hardworking family, and it was just a nice story. Now, earlier tonight, where is the queen of the West Side? She's back there. So when I grew up on the East Side. And Broadway was the dividing point. And if you lived on the East Side, you just stayed over there. If you lived on the West Side, you just stayed over there. It wasn't that we didn't get along. It just was the way life was growing up then. So I didn't know a lot about the West Side. But I'm going to go back to Minnie. So Minnie would have these ideas, and Minnie would call me and she'd say, you need to talk to whoever. Well, this one day she called me up. She said, you need to talk to Neil Draves Arpey. And some of you may know who and Neil has since passed away. She said, here's his number. He's expecting your call. I had never met Neil. He was a Catholic priest. I was not Catholic, but I called, and he had the most wonderful stories about his grandmother's grocery store. She basically raised him. And he grew up in this, and the whole experience was so heartwarming for me. It was something I knew nothing about. So, of course, I wrote that story. I was surprised to find out many things as he talked about her making the sausages. And then I got thinking about what was the demise. And the demise was the FDA came in because a lot of her things were homemade. And when those regulations came in, she couldn't do the sausage the same way. She couldn't have her own homemade sauce sold. And that was part of it, mobility. There were several factors that came in to play that was the demise of that store. But here it is at St. Michael's Feast, and it was just something that I didn't know anything about, but his accounts and then subsequent family members. What can you tell us, Queen of the West Side, about Arpey's? Because you said you're related to an Arpey?
Yeah, my husband's father is cousins to Joseph Arpey. Yeah, no, I lived there. I grew up on Walnut and then lived on Oak for most of my adult life, and that is right on the corner of Oak and Elm. So we went there every day. My mother would send us there all the time to get something. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Pumpkin seeds was a big thing. I don't know if anybody ever heard of that, but we used to get bags of pumpkin seeds there.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody? Yeah. Well,
another store that I didn't know a lot about, so once I started doing this, people started coming to me, and Arthur Ostroff is my gastroenterologist, and he was like, you have to write about Tanenbaums. I used to go there after Hebrew school because they had the best cookies. And I said, okay, I don't know a lot about it. But it was the only kosher market. And Tanenbaums had a fascinating story. I was able to track down the children who, Mr. Tanenbaum, Leo, is in New York City. He's a Wall Street lawyer, and he has a lot to say about that experience of growing up and how that service to community I knew nothing about. So I said, you know what, I think it's really important that we document all these stories, because think about today in Saratoga, or even in Ballston Spa, how many neighborhood stores are there?
Not many.
I would say it depends on how you categorize it, maybe 5 points. It's more of a deli coffee shop now, but yeah, it really, we don't have that same experience. We don't have that community gathering. And I think it's sad. It's lost history. So I wanted to, that was kind of my inspiration, again, for writing about this. Now, I went back through my book and I said, how many people, I wrote lots of stories, so I ended up writing for Simply Saratoga. Not all the stories I've written for them did I decide to include in the book. But this was the most recent store in my mind, in my lifetime. It was about a block and a half from my house, Pepper's Market. And probably the store that I knew the best. But when I counted up the number of people I interviewed for this book, it was 75. Now, some people I interviewed, like Minnie, multiple times, or Charlie was just one phone call away, and I'd call and say, do you remember whatever, you know. So there were some people I went to the well for several times. Susan was one that grew up here, and I ready access. I'd say, what do you know about whatever? And they could fill in some blanks for me and round out the story. But Pepper's, the one I knew the most, was the one I also interviewed the most people for. 9 people I ended up getting different perspectives. And the reason I chose to write about that was during COVID when life just seemed to be crashing in on us and things didn't seem real. Peppers was demolished. And it just was insult to injury for me. And I watched that rubble, and I literally stood there and cried. And I said, you know what, I have to write about this store because it's so rich in history. And so I did, and I set about, and here's what I found also was interesting about doing oral history, is you get two entirely different perspectives. The part of my life I remember Peppers the most, and it had a long string of people who owned it, was when Spencer and Marcia Hellwig owned it. And if any of you ever went in there, they gave a very different interview. I first talked to Marcia, and hers was kind of more warm and fuzzy. And I remember kids coming there before school, and we'd watch them while their parents were off at work. And she had warm, fuzzy memories. And Spencer had a different take. His was a little, and I remember writing down. So I looked back at my notebooks, and for Pepper's Market, I have 10 pages of interview notes, and a lot of things I did not use in this story. And when I look back at my notes for this presentation, what I really started my story with is our store is gone now, it's just a story. That Marcia said, kind of a warm, fuzzy thing that I braced and went from there. But this was my second choice. And Spencer said to me, because they had 4 kids, he goes, when this is over, I'm going to leave it to the kid I don't like the most. And he said that because he said, it is such hard work. And that's what he his take on it. And so his answers were very flip, very candid, and it rounded out the story for me. So after I finished this book, and it went on for a couple years because I would do different drafts, I looked back at all the stories I included, and I said, wow, I think the best written one in this whole book is Peppers, from my perspective. And I couldn't figure out why. And then when I was putting together my data, and I said, well, 9 people, I got 9 different perspectives. So if I were to ask you right now, just to kind of illustrate this perspective point, how many of you remember where you were the day JFK was shot? Where you were the day JFK was shot? Okay. So turn to your neighbor. What could you tell them about? Where were you? What were you doing? Who were you with? What day of the week do you think it was? Okay. Anybody want to? I heard. You think it was a Tuesday? Oh, then maybe it should be. So, Bill, what do you remember?
Okay.
You
so
think
I was in
clearly.
grade school, and I don't believe we had a TV or anything in school, but we had some sort of communication to find out.
What day of the week do you think it was?
God only knows.
Friday.
What day is it right now?
You said you thought it was a Tuesday. Yeah. Friday?
It was Friday.
Karen, you say Thursday. Susan?
Friday, I was in school.
Friday? Jim?
It was Friday because I was a 12-year-old paper boy for the Saratogian. I was in the school for 8th grade class on the 2nd floor, and then I went down to pick up my papers. We were watching it on TV. They rolled in one of those TVs they had back then. But they didn't tell us that he had passed away. Okay, I went down to get the papers, and I had a route around Mitchell Street, George Street, and along Union Avenue. And the papers came out, and it was about this big block print, Kennedy slain. I still have that paper, so I remember that.
So that, having that helped you.
The reason it was a Friday is because they told us that was the day you're supposed to collect your money, right? And the Saratogian was 42 cents a week, and you always get a 50-cent piece and keep the change. They said, don't even bother to try to collect the money on that Friday. Deliver that paper as fast as you can.
I too was a Saratogian delivery boy that day in north end of Boston's Farm, Maple Avenue. But I had stayed homesick. I was in ninth grade here in Boston. Stayed homesick that day with a cold or some fake illness, I'm sure. But I remember the TV coming on as I was bouncing around in my PJs and announcing it. And the whole screen went black and so on. I got well enough, one way or the other. I wanted to deliver the paper that day and see the paper that day. Waited on Front Street where the Saratoga office used to be, and got it. And the same thing, just people waiting to see what was in the news.
Mm-hmm. So we all think we have collective memories. Piper?
Well, I remember I was in 5th grade and I had a male teacher. He came into the room crying and we all didn't know what had happened. I don't even know if he told us, but I just remember him crying.
That probably had to be a strong memory because male teachers didn't probably cry at that time.
Yeah, it was
Bill?
very hard to see that.
What I really remember, because I don't think most of us were home when it actually, I think Bill was in mid-afternoon, but when we did get home and the TV went on, I think we all remember seeing Jack Ruby take out, Harvey Oswald was taken out by Jack Ruby.
So this little exercise is just kind of to illustrate to you how important it is to get lots of different perspectives. Because when I first asked you, I saw some looks like, a few people look sure. Somebody was thinking it was Tuesday. It was a Friday. But the more we talk, it starts bringing back memories. And that's why oral history is so important. As you talk, the more people, it's going to jog your memory. And some people remember, like Jim, it might not be your memory, but you've read it, and that helped remember things. And so that's why when you're doing oral history, it's so important to have objects. So here, again, this is what prompted me to write about peppers, because I just watched that. And this was at a time when you had to be masked to go outside. And all of our neighbors just stood there and watched this like we were at a wake. And it was very sad. And I think the most important interview I had was with Samantha Bossart, who said to me, you know what, it's not in a historic district, so we couldn't do anything, but the neighbors needed to step up to the plate to save it. You know, we need to hear from other people. So I really at that point thought, I am done. I've got all the stories I can about neighborhood stores. And then people kind of liked hearing about neighborhood businesses or places that no longer exist that are important. And so this is one of my favorite. I first grew up on Mitchell Street, and there was a place called the Spuyten Duyvil. It's been demolished, but it was Philip Roth's favorite watering hole. It was owned by a former Cotton Club dancer, and it was also the piano bar kept me awake at night from my Mitchell Street bedroom. So this is one of my favorite stories in the book, where I recreated that. My other favorite story in the book is one that, when I first wrote it for the magazine, I went back to it and I totally redid it. So this is Farmer's Hardware. How many of you remember this store? It was a great store. And it was on Broadway. Right now, I think the store is called Lily's. It's right near the Mountain Man. And I first interviewed, I was lucky enough to have the Serrata's grandchildren in my class as a teacher. And we were pretty close. So I interviewed Bernie's children, Ben and Marcy, for this. And Marcy took me to meet Caroline, and actually not meet, reconnect. She was once my art teacher in elementary school. But here was the great thing about going to her house in Cambridge, is that she had kept all these objects that I had kind of remembered from this amazing store, because upstairs was a toy store, and downstairs hardware, art supplies, because Caroline was an art teacher. And it was just an amazing place. But being there, I would have never seen the objects. I wouldn't have touched them, and it really helped me round out the picture. And she also had this, and it's not a very good copy, so you probably won't pick up. This is from a newspaper article, and this was of Seventh Heaven, it was called, the toy shop upstairs. Do you notice anything about the salesperson there in that photograph? And this is, it's not a very good photograph. It's a copy of a newspaper that's blown up. But it's a black woman who's a salesperson. And in 1968, that was unusual in Saratoga. But what came out in the story was that Bernie was very involved in the NAACP, and he believed in this, and he was the first mom and pop shop owner on Broadway to have a black employee with customer facing. And that was kind of an important thing. And so I wrote this story and I kind of documented what a special place it was, how much everyone missed it. But I kind of went back and I said, I'm missing something in this story. So before I decided to include it in my book, I revisited the family. And I said, Caroline at that point had passed away. And here's where I came up with some of it. I don't generally like to read, but this photo is going to give you a little hint about what I think was an important part that I missed, because Caroline didn't talk about this. I was aware of it, but I didn't realize the importance in Saratoga's history. So I'm just going to read you a couple paragraphs from the book. So this is the Serrata family was home asleep when the Saratoga chief of police called Bernie and reported that the nearby Presbyterian church was on fire. Bernie's building was next door, and it was in danger. So this is the store. Bernie raced to the store, hopeful to reach the store safe to rescue his business records. Lisa, that's his daughter, remembers the middle of the night, mile-long walk with her mom to the store. And this is my favorite quote from Lisa, and this is, again, rewriting the story. It sounded like fireworks. We walked through a shower of gently falling scorched, charred, and burning paper. Pages of hymnals had gone up in an explosion and floated all over town. Soon we would see massive flames shooting from the church's roof. My mom began to cry and wondered what they would do next. We couldn't imagine anything was left of our building, and we hoped that Dad was safe. But miraculously, it was mostly intact when we arrived at the Colliner building. And then it goes on to describe what happened to the back of the store. But that left this gaping hole, and today there's a big parking lot there. But this is what it had looked like. And I said, that's an important part of this store and this story, and I totally missed it. And had I not gone back and revisited it with the children and decided to say, there's more here, I would have missed that important part of the story.
And because of that church, when all those Dutch elm were decimated on Broadway, the one behind the church and to the right remains today, a beautiful Dutch elm.
Yes.
That's why it didn't get, because it was blocked by that church.
It was.
Woo-hoo.
Yeah. So again, old historic photographs really help bring important parts of the story to life. Another way to look at pictures and interviews is by doing a tour. So the Preservation Foundation did a special behind-the-scenes tour of the Adirondack Trust one Saturday afternoon after they closed. You got to pay $50, and Charlie Waite took you through the bank and gave you the inside back end of the story. And it was fascinating. I had known this bank my whole life, been a customer, went in there almost every day of my life, and I thought I knew everything there was to know about it, but I really didn't. I didn't know about the sniper hatch that he told us about. And so that was another fascinating way to find and dig deeper into what I think is one of the most amazing buildings in all of Saratoga. Next door to that was my father's office. So I grew up, my father was a funeral director. He co-owned Burke's funeral home. And when I was younger, this was his office building. And this is where I spent a lot of my time. And my job in college downstairs was to man the office because we didn't have answering machines. So when my dad was at a funeral, I would man the phone and read the trade journals and hope I didn't have to let anybody into the embalming room or anything like that. And the Burkes lived upstairs. So this was another story that was very near and dear to me. And I wrote a lot of this from my memory. Here's a business. So when I organized the book, I decided to write about my neighborhood and then kind of to take people down Broadway. So I'm just highlighting some of the photographs that helped me fill out that walk down Broadway and the mom and pop businesses there. This was a place that I had very vague memories of, but thanks to a lot of great interviews, I was able to fill in a lot about it. How many of you remember Congress Theater? What do you remember about it? Anybody? Sue? Do you have?
That's what it looked like.
Susan?
I remember the very elegant bathrooms, like New York City, that you would see at the big theaters in New York.
Everything had velvet drapes.
They did. Wayne?
I remember the live shows where we could get in for 20 cents as a kid. And they would have scary shows on Halloween, so Joe went home scared out of your wits.
Well, I started talking, so this was owned by Mr. Benton, and I started the Bentons. There's many Bentons, so you don't have to look too far to find a Benton to interview. So I started talking to the Bentons about this, and at one point, in order to get customers there during the Depression, women would get, they would call dish days, and I was amazed at this. If you paid 20 cents, you got free dishes and then also a movie. So, but this was the quintessential elegant. And so the Bolster collection and the historic photos really helped. And this is just one of maybe 10 photos I had of the Congress Theater. Recreate something that I had very vague, faint memories of because this building went on to be other things. I remember it vaguely being a roller skating rink.
And then Willie Lum's.
Willie Lum's Chinese. This was many different things.
Where was that?
This is, today it is on the corner, it's now, I think, Bobbles, the corner of Spring Street and Broadway, right across from the Saratoga Arts Center. And the building has been an amazing plethora of things. And so to write about this was also fascinating. It started once as the Congress Hotel Ballroom, an annex to it. And then there was a bridge, an iron bridge across Spring Street. So it was fascinating, again, to kind of be transported through these photographs. So if you were not able to talk to somebody, you could. Another story, so they say write what you know, and of course I've known the Boken family for a long time, and Ann Boken and Ann's Washington Inn. Ann played bridge with me and was just the most wonderful person. So I couldn't not include that in my book. And it's, again, one of my favorite stories, and here's a picture of Ann and her husband. And I highly encourage you to read about this mom and pop business, which was a totally a surprise to me when I looked into the history. So as I started looking at mom and pop businesses, I look at things and I said, I need to change the perspective because we look today at that property and we say, that's what it is, and we think it's always been that. But before that, it was McCarty's Hospital, which was a hospital for basically the poor, or it also many people gave birth there. And before that, it was one of the first summer cottages here. So it hasn't always been the same thing, and those were things that really surprised me. Another area that I felt is important to recreate is the gut. And I love this picture that Lucy Kettlewell created of when it was a gas station. And I do co-own Ben & Jerry's, so this building is near and dear to me, of when it was a gas station. You can't have a book without including Hattie. Hattie was also an important part of my family's life. She was close to my dad. She came when he died before the wake was official. And she did so much for Saratoga. And she was in different locations. So again, that's another favorite story that I wrote about. And her life was so rich and her legacy lives on. Next door to Hattie's in the gut, Mother Goldsmith, which has been so many different things. Right now, I think it's yet again trying to be sold. The latest restaurant in there is just going out of business. But Nate Goldsmith and Lou's Luncheonette, which is now Compton's, I kind of combine those two together because you could not separate them. A great story there is Lou's Luncheonette, and that captures Lou so well. I didn't know a lot about the West Side, but I felt it's really important as we've got the Queen of the West Side here to recreate it. So I was lucky enough to know people that I went to school with who did know about it. And my friend Paul Batchelor said, well, my grandparents had Ma DiMartino's, and that's often overlooked, but their story was really important. And I included that in the book, and I talked to all of the relatives that are still alive that I could find, because there was a fire. It was kind of the quintessential gatherings place, and I think this photograph says so much. Bowling.
That's where I started bowling.
Where you started bowling. I often have this fantasy in my mind that if my dad ever came back for an afternoon, you know, if he got beamed down, where would I take him? If I had 2 hours to show him Saratoga, what would shock him the most? And I think taking him down Railroad Place would shock him the most, because now it's just a series of tall 5 and 6 story condo buildings. But Saratoga Bowl, that just was a great photo. And I saw that and I said, I have to write about this. And Joe Duell was a classmate of mine. His dad was the bowler who started it off, and he was a professional bowler. And it was the first place to have the automatic pins. And bowling then was very different than it is today, because there wasn't a lot to do in Saratoga at that time for entertainment. Bowling was a big option. So I felt I had to include that in my book as well. If probably you're a little younger than me, the Rafters. And thanks to Susan, this is Greg Roble, and the creation of this building was amazing. Greg has since passed away, and when Susan said, well, here's his number, here's how you can talk to him, we talked a little bit, but we mostly wrote over the course of maybe a month. And he was really at the point where his throat condition with cancer was such that he couldn't really talk, but he had great stories. And the Rafters was a place that for many people was so unique as a nightclub. And so I had a lot of fun recreating that, and in tandem, because his parents also own Kaydeross Park. Bolster Collection has maybe 15 amazing pictures of Kaydeross Park. And so I put those two together because the Roble family owned it along with Bobby DeAndre. And I recreated that, which again is lost Saratoga history. For my family, we ate, there was one time my parents renovated their house and we ate at Pennell's maybe 4 times a week. So Pennell's, we had our own table there. Pennell's is often not talked about when you talk about restaurants and you read in current magazines, but to me, I think it is a quintessential mom and pop restaurant. And so I had to include Pennell's as an important representation of restaurants. So those were kind of the photographs that helped me and why I think that's important. Another, as I kind of get ready, because I want to have some time for questions and I don't want to keep it sitting too long. Another thing that I was very fortunate, across the street growing up, my very first friend in life was Maureen Sweeney, and her mom, Bee, was our city historian, and kind of like a second mom to me. And Bee passed away 2 years ago, and Renee and her brother left me her collection of postcards. And I have this amazing collection. So I brought some of them here, and there was something I never knew about, the House of Panza, or the House of Pompeii. And it was a recreated from Pompeii museum that was built in 1891 by Franklin Webster. The building still exists today, and the atrium, by law, is still exactly the same. It's the home of Death Wish Coffee. But in the interim, it was lots of different things. So that, I also felt, was a really important story to include, because it was at one time the Jewish synagogue. It's been a lot of different things, but again, part of Saratoga history that we can't overlook.
Where is that?
This is at 261 Broadway, just next to Complexion Spa, the new condo that Sonny Bonaccio had built.
Across from St. Peter's.
Across from St. Peter's High School. Oh, okay. But it's the exterior is exactly today as it was.
Yes.
Except for the roof. The top roof is taken off. There was a terrace up there. Again, another story that really surprised me and I really loved writing. So how about, as we wrap up, hopefully I've inspired you, because I forgot to give you this stat when I told you I interviewed 75 people. When I look back for this particular book, because there's other people, 10 of those people have passed. So I was lucky to get Neil Arpey, to get Arpey's before he died. I was lucky to get Greg Roble before he died. And I look back, Minnie, of course, was a treasure trove, has passed away. I was lucky to get all these people. So if there's somebody, even a relative, that you want to ask some questions, don't put it off. Do it now, because you just don't know. And I feel very fortunate that these 10 people gave me these nuggets of wisdom, and I was able to record it down before it's lost. And I would love to be able to go back, because I have more questions for some of these people, and they're not there. So I hope that you will be inspired to maybe create your own oral history of something that you're interested in, your family history, or something in your neighborhood. How about some questions? Anybody? Or maybe you asked them going along.
Well, I have a question.
Okay.
Why was your dad and Minnie having lunch every day?
That's a good question. They had lunch every day. Oh, but they weren't the only two. It was Ellen Ruley. So there was this little group, but my dad's office was next to Lou's Luncheonette. So he often didn't have a lot of time because he might have a wake in the afternoon. And Minnie's office, Minnie was the secretary for Judge Sweeney. Her office was downtown. So there was a group of people who were just kind of old-time Saratogians, and they would meet every day for lunch at Lou's. They had their own booth in the front, still there. You know, you didn't sit, no one else could sit there.
I always sit in their booth.
Yeah, okay. Well, it was lunchtime. No, that was their booth, and everybody else knew that. Anyone else have a question? Yes?
I'm interested with the distribution of the grocery stores, the corner groceries. There was a large proportion around the west side and the northwest side. And you indicated why they exist, because they gave credit. And there's a good smattering on the east side. I'm wondering what supported those stores on the north side?
Okay, that's an excellent question, and I kind of skimmed over that. What I found when I did this map on, I think it was Beekman Street. So John Connor said there were 11 neighborhood stores. And each one, and the people who opened them were from different parts of Italy. So one would maybe specialize in tomato sauce from Bari because their tomatoes were different than the tomatoes that the DiMartinos from where they hailed from, Sicily. I'm not sure where the DiMartino, off the top of my head. But they each had their own unique spin on something. And these were immigrants at the time, and they didn't have another way. Often these stores were the living room of their house. So they would just open up a room in the house, and then while they were getting themselves going, the family lived upstairs, and this was the way they put bread on the table. So they didn't have a lot of money, but they had enough to get by.
I was actually asking what supported the stores in the north end of town.
North end.
Where you actually had quite a bit of money. And you didn't have the people.
Okay, so when you read my story on peppers, you'll find out the August racing families would come, and at that time, they would rent a house for an entire month. And we didn't have DoorDash, we didn't have Instacart. And so the butlers, the chefs, whatever, would call a store like Peppers, for instance. Peppers did most of its business in August. And they would say, we need, and they would have specialty items. And so Spencer would get it, and they would have huge tabs, but they would know that they would pay at the end of the year. So they would get specialized service from all the racing families. That racing was different then. So families, I had worked for a racing family for many years. Racing families would come for the entire summer, and they would buy everything from these little stores, believe it or not. Mm-hmm. So that's what supported them. Yes?
I like the way you opened with your relationship to the subject that you were presenting and your familiarity with it. It seems like it opens the door to other aspects of life during this time, whether it be schools, churches, factories, taverns, whatever.
Oh, I did some taverns, yes. And so when I decided to write the book, I decided when I was writing these stories, I write for Simply Saratoga. There's another magazine in town called Saratoga Living. I really admire their work. At the time when I started writing, they had a young 30-year-old writer, and he would try to write about things in Saratoga, but he didn't grow up with them. And he always wrote his stories in first person. And I would go to the library, and Victoria, whoever was in there, would be complaining, oh, his stories, he always makes it about himself. And that kind of got me thinking. I said, I have to be careful not to make this about myself, but to actually record it. So I always wrote my stories in third person. And then when I decided to put together a book, I said, you know what, I'm going to change it and write it from my perspective and only include things that I really knew or knew someone really well who did. So I switched it over. So a lot of things in my book are only just things that were really personal. I've written probably 3 times as many articles on other things, but I didn't include them in the book.
You say that well, that the attribution, the relationship between the two of your subject.
Thank you. Jim?
With all those interviews, are you nostalgic for that era?
Oh yeah, like Charlie, like when Charlie and I talk, Charlie is an 1800s guy. I'm a 1960s girl, that's just, I love that period of 1960. I think even though probably things weren't perfect, I have very many fond memories of Saratoga at that time. I thought it was the best place in the world to grow up.
Yeah, what I miss is the interaction, the front porch, you walk along the street. I lived on White Street. And everybody knew everybody, and you'd stop and you'd talk, and all that is kind of like gone.
It's different
everybody
now.
Lives in their,
life is different. It's not bad because if we didn't have progress, we would end up like some of these small towns who've kind of shriveled up and died. I mean, we need new blood and new energy and new businesses. And partly too, this book is really a tribute to all the mom and pop stores that still exist, that keep us going, that make us unique. So we're not just one big Walmart, one big Taco Bell, chain type stores. Well, thank you for coming.
This was
And
fascinating, for sure.
I hope you learned something.
Are your books for sale?
They are for sale, and if you're interested, they're $16. I have them for sale at Northshire if you didn't bring money tonight. I do have a Venmo account if you're interested in getting a book.
The line forms in the next room.
Okay, the line form. I know some of you, like William, has bought 3 of my books. 3, yeah, I know some of you have already purchased them and you just came to hear more about Saratoga because you love it as much as I do. I will. I would love to autograph them.